What is your experience in training, the indigenous people? So when you mention training, you're talking about local people to that context. And what's your experience in that?
Well, to back up just a step, I've had the privilege of doing roughly 60 or so short-term mission trips. And even before I came to know about iTech and Empower, I was involved in training trips, but this was training U.S. dental students and Canadian dental students, primarily in Jamaica. It's a ministry called the Christian Dental Society. And a good friend of mine, Dr. Jim Carney, and I...
Who lives in Florida, but hasn't made it up here yet, to our knowledge.
Yes, I hope he gets here at some point. And so Jim really created this ministry in Jamaica that he and I and many others worked through. And we got to the point where we and others that worked with us were taking 15 or more schools to Jamaica, over 300 students a year prior to COVID. And it was training, but it was training students who had at least a couple of years under their belt. They knew the basic anatomy, they knew the tooth numbers, they knew how many roots those teeth had. And so we had a bit of a head start. And my first training trip was to Nigeria back in, I believe it was 2009. And we had 4 doctors and 16 students. And I remember at the end of that week thinking, by the way, for those listeners who don't realize it, this training occurs in about a week. We're trying to teach Christians in remote third world areas to do in a week what we took 4 years to learn. And I went home from Nigeria thinking, no way, this is not possible. All we've done is given them enough information to cause problems. A little knowledge is a dangerous thing. And I pretty much thought never again. And then a few years later, I was in Louisville, Kentucky at a missions conference, the GMHC conference in Louisville. And one of the speakers was a guy named Caleb, who I know you know, John, and actually you both know him. And he spoke about how he had received the training and he had gone on to do well and train others. And it struck me, this stuff really works. And it just blew my mind. And yet it shouldn't have, because we know that God's grace is sufficient. And not every student that we train on these iTech and Empower trips shows enough of a ability or capacity to be able to continue on. But those that are certified, they go on, they get better as they remove teeth, and they're doing it for the sake of Christ. So I became fully convinced, not just through what Caleb said, but through other trips, that God really does bless this and that he utilizes it to spread the word. One little just mini chapter is a few years later, I went to Myanmar on a trip, and that's where I finally got to meet Caleb. I had to go all the way to Myanmar to meet a guy from India that convinced me of the veracity of these trips.
Well, and it's interesting, that's kind of I think that was the second dental training that iTech ever did was in India with Caleb, and that's one of the stories we often tell about opening doors for the gospel of a place that was very hostile and resistant to Christianity. It killed a pastor a few months earlier, yet the reception was totally different. And so I do think, it's one of the things you say, Bill, I was in West Virginia 2021 last year, and speaking, I met 2 recent dental school graduates who had only pulled 10 teeth in 4 years of dental school, and I realized we're narrowing the focus of what we're teaching. Our goal is on a training trip, the students pull 25, 30 teeth in a week. We're not giving them all the fluff of the higher learning of but we're more of a trade school approach of this is what you need to know, and focusing on that. And so I was doubtful as well. 2011, my first training trip was with Empower, and I went to Uganda, and I think the valuable thing for me was there were 2 students who had been trained the year before who came back. And I think that's what, if I had just been there for the training itself, I might not have believed in it. But when I saw 2 of the students who had returned and had taken out several hundred teeth in a year, and that's when I started to believe that this was possible. And so I think, just getting to see, taking a step back and getting to see fruit from, people really just embracing the training and taking off with it. And not everybody does, but,
It's an amazing week the way it works out. Monday in the classroom and trying to teach them whatever you can, and it's all theoretical because they've never done it. And then Monday evening, they're giving injections on each other. And sometimes you lose a few students at that point because every person receiving an injection realizes the person giving it has never done this before.
It is more blessed to give than receive.
Yes, that's a good verse around that time. And then they started in the clinic Tuesday afternoon perhaps. And around Wednesday, sometimes I think none of them are getting it. But by Friday, by God's grace, you've got people who demonstrate the kind of skill that God can use for his glory.
And how does this is obviously meeting a felt need. How does this open doors for the gospel in your experience?
Well, this is the really beautiful part of it, and that the fact that physical health and spiritual health are so closely related in so many ways. And when you can care for someone with skill and compassion, whether it's a toothache or whether it's some other sort of a medical problem, whatever it might be, you've relieved their acute pain, you've earned a certain level of respect, and often they'll wonder the reason for the hope that's in you. And so that can be such a beautiful platform to communicate why we do what we do and how there is even greater blessing in the spiritual realm than what you can do for them physically. Because when we remove a painful tooth and alleviate pain, it's often a temporary fix. There's probably a tooth around the corner waiting to go bad, causing more pain. And yet, when a person sees God's grace in Jesus Christ through that has eternal implications, and it's a beautiful opportunity.